The President of the United States is shown giving a statement in front of the media, that he and his troops will never retreat until the end of his life. He was also not afraid that the military would try to overthrow him. Elsewhere, a woman named Lee is shown, who will be the main character in this film. Lee is a journalist who works at a television station in charge of covering various news. Lee has a co-worker named Joe, who always accompanied him wherever he went. Lee goes to a city that is in a state of war to cover the news about what is happening in that place. Upon arrival, Lee then covered and saw various civilians demonstrating their disappointment with the president until there was a commotion between the two parties. Lee then accidentally saw a woman who was hit by a police officer while taking pictures. Without hesitation, Lee helped him, and asked him if he was also a journalist. The woman immediately introduced her name to Lee. If it's Jesse. He also said that he is a photographer who dreams of becoming a journalist. The plan is that he will use his current photos to apply to become a journalist. Soon there was a huge explosion that killed dozens of people. Fortunately, Lee and Jesse survived the explosion. Meanwhile, Lee immediately invited Jesse to photograph various things and teach her about making interesting news. In the evening, Lee and Joe went to their senior named Sam, to ask him for advice on the plans of those who will go to the White House. Sam then asks Joe and Lee what news they will be covering next. Joe replied that he had information that the military would raid the White House and kill the president. This is because there is no meeting point after negotiating. Hearing this, Sam immediately felt shocked because he got the news that a journalist who covered the news at the White House was even shot by troops from the president. This mission could be a disaster for them. Lee then convinces Sam that his plan is going to be okay, and Sam decides to join the mission. When it was long enough to chat, Lee decided to take a break to his room. But it was Jesse who came to him and thanked him. Lee then smile and say that what he was taught before is nothing. But Jesse is grateful again because she thinks Lee has taught her many things. When he was alone, Lee always remembered about the tragic events he covered in his news. This is a side effect of journalism. Even Lee could not close his eyes because he always imagined about the various things he covered in the news. The next morning, when Lee was about to leave for the White House in Washington, he was surprised to see Jesse sitting in the back seat. Joe then explains that Jesse asked to come with them to get a new experience to become a journalist. But Lee also objected, because the news they will cover this time is more dangerous than the previous news. Moreover, Jesse has no experience at all to cover the news in the middle of the war. Jesse then reassures Lee that all will be well. With no other choice, Lee allows Jesse to come along, as long as he obeys his orders and doesn't act rashly. Then they began their journey to their destination. In the middle of the journey shown, the state of the city is very chaotic, as if a dead city. When they arrived at the border of the war zone, a military officer checked Lee and the others about their license to cover the news. When all was safe, they continued their journey. While passing a gas station, Joe decided to buy some jerry cans of gasoline that they would use as a backup for their gasoline. Because when they have entered the battle area closer later, there will be no gas station selling there. The gas station guard then asked Lee to double the price if they wanted to buy gasoline there. Because all this fuel in wartime is very scarce, Lee had no other choice but to accept it. In addition, Jesse asked permission to go to a place because she saw something. Not wanting anything to happen to Jesse, Lee decides to follow her. Unexpectedly, Jesse came to a warehouse in which there were two men who were being hanged. A man who was a Pombenson guard explained that the men had committed looting. That's why they were suspended. Now feeling that this could be interesting news, Lee asked the man for permission to take a picture of him. The man happily allowed Lee to photograph him with the two men who were being hanged. When returning to continue the journey, Jesse immediately cried because she felt bad for the two people who were hanging in the warehouse. Lee later said that's what journalism always feels like. But they must be professional and not get carried away. After arriving in a town, Lee tells Joe to stop his car when they see a helicopter that seems to have crashed. Lee then told Jesse to photograph him from several sides. Lee also said that in choosing the news does not have to be entirely about humans. Sometimes they also require some objects such as the destruction of vehicles and buildings. This will make the news more interesting. In the evening they decided to rest first before continuing the journey. Above the sky they also saw a variety of incessant gunfire from the territory of the war zone. Lee immediately wondered if this war could end or if it would be the beginning of America's destruction. Meanwhile, Joe comes to Jesse, who cannot sleep because of the shadow of the previous incident. Joe then advises Jesse to think about the most beautiful thing in her life so that maybe Jesse can forget about the bad events she has seen. The next day, Lee and others covered the news of a shootout between the government and the military. When Jesse was shooting from several angles, Lee immediately pulled her. Because in covering news in the midst of war, they also have to pay attention to reasonable limits in placing positions. When the enemy had been killed and pressed, Lee invited Jesse to photograph them both dead and alive. When going to photograph various people who have been killed and covered in a lot of blood, Jesse immediately felt weak and felt like vomiting. After covering the news, Joe also invited them to go to the evacuation of the population that they might be able to cover as the next news. Upon arrival, Jesse immediately went to be alone because she felt traumatized by the previous incident. Lee then goes to her and tells her that Jesse will get used to the course of time. The more experience she gets, then she will get used to later. Lee also said that at the moment Jesse is in the stage of mental formation. The next day they decided to continue their journey. When passing through an urban area, Joe was confused by a clothing store that was still open in the middle of the war. Joe then went to the owner of the store and tried to interview him. According to him, what was done by the owner of the clothing store was very unique and interesting to report. Soon they reached the Washington border. A few kilometers away, when going through residential areas, they were even shot by someone from one direction. Not far away there were two snipers who reported that they were in a war zone. A few moments later the two snipers managed to shoot the enemy and told Lee and the others to immediately return to continue the journey. When passing through the forest area, Lee was surprised by a car behind him. It's like they're chasing him. Sam then told Lee to lower the speed of the car. Maybe the car behind them wanted to go ahead. Unexpectedly, it turned out that the car was driven by a journalist friend of Joe named Tony and also Boha. They both come from China. Joe greeted his two friends and asked them where they were going. Tony gets into Joe's car and tells him they're going to the White House. In addition, Jesse even did a crazy thing by getting into the car from Boha. Then Boha also said that they would meet again later. Seeing that, Lee immediately felt angry because he was worried about Jesse because Boha was driving the car very fast. Sure enough, when they passed the settlement they also saw a car driven by Boha stopped there. Not far from there they also saw Boha with Jesse, who was being held by the two people. Not only that, they also saw many corpses there in army uniforms. In other words, the two men were troops from the government or the enemy. With no other choice, Lee decided to negotiate. Meanwhile, Sam decides to get back in the car just in case. Joe then spoke up and tried to negotiate that they just wanted to pass and didn't intend to interfere. The two men laughed and asked where Joe and the others were from. When Boha replied that he was from China, he was immediately shot to death. It didn't stop there. When Tony also replied that he was from China, he was also shot to death. Not long after that came Sam, who immediately hit the two men. Then Joe and Lee and Jesse also immediately decided to rush away from there. One of the men opened fire as he tried to leave. On the way, Joe also felt very sad about the death of his two friends. Meanwhile, Sam, who was driving, was suddenly unconscious. When Lee checked, it turned out that Sam had been shot in the stomach. Seeing this, Joe immediately moved her to the back seat and tied her stomach so that the blood would stop coming out. When he arrived at the military headquarters, Sam first breathed his last and could not be saved. This made Joe feel hysterical and sad. Joe then tells Lee that they must get news about the president so that Sam's death is not in vain. In addition, Lee tried to come to Jesse, who was sad. Lee then says that Jesse will replace Sam to cover the news. All three are now part of the team. Hearing this, Jesse was immediately excited and said that she would not disappoint Sam. The night of the White House raid had begun. The two parties immediately shoot each other with courage. Jesse tries to shoot from various directions in order to get a good photo. Meanwhile, Lee and Joe try to cover the news about the state of affairs in the White House. The situation escalated when the military deployed several tanks to fire missiles towards the White House. Shortly after that, several bulletproof cars came out of the White House and drove very fast. Some military forces immediately tried to block him because they thought the president was there. But Lee thought that it was just a diversion, and the president is in the White House trying to escape. When they entered the White House, some of the military forces met a woman who was a loyal soldier of the president. The woman also tried to negotiate so that the president would not be killed. The soldiers immediately shot the woman and said that the negotiations were over. Wen will enter the chamber of the president. Some of the guards in the room also opened fire continuously, which made the military troops unable to move further. This moment was immediately used by Jesse to photograph the perpetrators. But Jesse even crossed the reasonable limit. Just as he was about to be shot, Lee came to his rescue. Lee was eventually shot and killed on the spot. The president was also arrested. When the president is about to be assassinated, Joe tells the president to say his last word. After that, the military immediately shot him. And then the movie ends.